So a change from my last video. This time I'm going to look at a bike that I do not think is pretty at all. Now there's many reasons for this which I'll go into, but first a disclaimer. I don't blame any designers or anyone who's worked on the bike in particular for how this one came out. I have a suspicion that what's been going on here are cost, time pressures, lack of budget, possibly interference from people who are not creative, perhaps a marketing influence, perhaps a business influence. But knowing the history of the Harley Davidson design team, knowing how many beautiful bikes they have actually made, for this to come out the same studio says to me that external forces have been playing on them that we are perhaps not aware of. This is also just my opinion. I'm going to look at it creatively, see what works, what doesn't work, and I'm going to point a few things out. Otherwise, opinions are like arseholes. Everyone's got one, and I can be an arsehole. So if you've got any thoughts or you disagree with me, put them in the comments. It'll be fun to see what people think of this one, as it's very different from the last video I done. I do intend on doing a huge range of bikes, given the popularity of the first video and given the fact that I really enjoy it. Okay, let's get started. Now there's something with design that you've always got to remember, and that's to judge things not only in photographs and images you see of it, but also in the flesh as well. See how it looks actually in real life, because there's been many occasions where, and it's not just motorbikes, it can be cars, it can be any number of things, they don't work in photos but they look really good in real life. Can't explain this, don't know why it happens, but it does happen. So my first encounter with this bike was I was out driving one day, not on the bike, and I love to see bikes out and about. You see amazing things people have, like mad old Nortons or amazing Ducatis, all sorts of amazing bikes just as you're driving around. And this guy passed me one day on one of these and it just looked ungainly. The ergonomics of it looked ungainly, the guy looked uncomfortable. Visually, the bike just didn't read when it went past me. I wasn't even sure what it was at first. And there just seemed to be, it just seemed like a black mass. It didn't have much form to it, not much shape to it. So that's why I thought this would make a good video. I could go into the design of it and see what personally I don't think is working. What you have to remember as well is beauty in things. You can find beauty in ugly things as well as beautiful things. So you can be like a really ugly dog that's beautiful. You can have it like an old rundown building that's been overgrown, that can be beautiful. Things that would be classed as ugly can actually be beautiful, but there is rule sets for it. And when we get into this bike, I'll show you some of the things I think have went wrong. Okay, one of the very first things I noticed when I was gathering images for this is the images of it on the Harley Davidson website have been photoshopped. They've went through and edited the images so it doesn't appear as visually noisy. They've used depth of field and strong dark shadows to hide a multitude of sins. This is one of the reasons I say always go and see something in the flesh, because marketing imagery is very rarely what you get in real life. I'll show more realistic pictures later on in this that other people have taken and posted online, either for reviews or personal pictures, things like that, and you will see a marked difference from the ones that are actually on the Harley Davidson website. Okay, unsurprisingly, just dropping it into a golden ratio, you can see it, proportionally it does work quite well. Everything's where it should be. There's nothing particularly odd or out there. I would expect nothing less. It would be very strange if it didn't fit within that. So the key lines through the bike, a couple of things I noticed with this. First of all, they don't stand out obviously. On some bikes you just see the line immediately, and in here there was a lot of confusing shapes and forms in the way of the lines. Of course, unsurprisingly, they've kept the lines the same as the very original bike. However, that's where I think the similarities end. Now, one of the reasons your brain doesn't register it as a particularly attractive thing to look at is there's so many conflicting shapes and forms. First of all, there's a mixture of curved forms and angular forms. Second, so a really good example is if you look at the seat is made up of quite sharp angles, and then it's jammed between the fuel tank and the rear wheel arch, which are both really smooth, soft curves. This is extremely jarring. The classic V-twin engine as well is pretty much the shape of a human heart, which is such a lovely thing to incorporate into the design of stuff. It almost sets the design before you've even started, and this is one of the reasons so many of their bikes are absolutely beautiful, because they've really played on this. However, on this one, it just, the engine itself, the shapes and forms in it are fighting with the soft curve shapes that are also fighting with the angular shapes. So let's start with the exhaust, which is always a key feature on any bike and has to be considered in any bike design. Often I'll see beautiful bikes and people have put an aftermarket exhaust on it and just totally ruined the whole look of the bike. However, a Harley Davidson owner on one of the forums described the exhaust on this as parts of a leaf blower, and you can't really disagree with that. They've taken the 3 small notches that were on the exhausts of the original bike, but again, it's such a huge lumping mass of an exhaust. It doesn't flow particularly well around the engine. Some of the exhausts on the V-twins are absolutely gorgeous in the way they loop round. They do such a nice job on some bikes of them looping and following the shape of the bike. But this, it's got that large, oversized mass. A shotgun exhaust would look so much better. The part where it splits into both cylinders looks like lady parts. It's just not attractive at all. It's possibly one of the worst looking exhausts you could imagine to put on a bike of this shape. I think the fuel tank's coming down here, which is fine and not have it in the regular place. However, when the bike is in some photos and tilted to the side, it looks like a ball sack. Not a great choice. Now, these plastic elements at the front, a lot of bike manufacturers, so namely Indian's one of them, Triumph's another, when they have a water-cooled bike, they go to great lengths to hide the radiator, the connecting hoses, all these various parts. And on this bike, it's an absolute mess. They've just stuck them on the front of the frame. They've made no effort to hide them, no effort to blend them with the frame. Rather than embrace the sort of exposed engineering as well, they've covered them in the most ugly plastic covers that don't fit with any of the design language of the rest of the bike at all. So if you can see, they've got various angles on them, nothing matches up, the angles are all going in different directions, there's hoses coming out of it. There's just not been thought and efforts went into it. Now what you have to remember is to do something clever, like say Triumph would do, to hide the radiator. Takes a lot of time and money. And this is where I think the design team have been rushed on this, and the engineers have been rushed and just been told to get it done on time. Otherwise, I wouldn't imagine any engineer or artist would have been happy with this sticking out the front. It completely ruins the profile of the bike. It's massive, it's just ugly, it sticks out in front. It's just not a pleasant group of shapes at all. It's a key, what I would call, ugly feature of the bike. Combining that with the exhaust as well, it's off to a poor start already. I've seen some with cowls and some without, and again, normally on a bike you'll see they'll make a feature out of it, whatever the sort of cowling is, and mix it with the lighting, and the shapes and forms will match with maybe the wing mirrors, and it'll be incorporated in some way. I'll use Royal Enfield as a good example. On the classic 650 and 350, they do a wonderful job of blending all this in and make it a real classic Royal Enfield feature. On some other bikes, on Triumphs and stuff, they do a wonderful job of this. It's a real sort of eye-catching feature of the bike. This one here, it just looks like they bought one off of Temu, to be honest. It's the most generic, space-filling, and again, the fact that they haven't taken time and laboured over this and built a shape language into it, which they even do on their other bikes, says to me this is cost cutting, or people were rushed, or the budget wasn't there. So one of the great things about oil cooled V-twins is the space you get around the cylinder heads and how you can see through the bike and how it complements to the overall shape of the bike. It looks literally like a heart within the bike. It's a wonderful feature. However, here there's this mass of random triangles and shapes and lines all fighting with each other. There's plastics, there's metals, and again there's sat atop the engine that's all various shapes going on. There's curves, there's angles, there's a circle of the air filter, there's a circle of the gearbox and drivetrain underneath. On top of it you've got a soft smooth teardrop style fuel tank. So these shapes here, again, if you were designing it, you'd want to cover these up. Either you make something a feature and you build the design language into it, or if it's something like this, if it's stressed member elements or something like that, you do things to hide them. And here it looks rushed. It looks like there was no effort to hide them or make a feature of them. They're just there occupying the space. And because it's so many lines going in different directions and different materials, it just completely throws off the pleasant eye line you would normally have on a bike like this. So these shapes here, the back part where you would normally attach your panniers is very much a traditional Harley Davidson shape, and they've kept that. However, there's angles on this which then match the angles of the seat. But because of the seat and these angles, they are fighting against the curves of the fuel tank, the exhaust and the rear wheel arch. So you can see it here. I've picked out what I would consider to be angular shapes, and you can see how jarring and sharp they are. Then on top of those there's these curved shapes, so the curves and the angles are fighting amongst themselves for your eye's attention. Now if you're going to do a bike based on, say, angles, or you have a particular shape language or something you want to express through the bike, and you'll even see this on other different Harley Davidsons, they'll have beautiful curves and they'll follow those curves all through the whole bike. It'll be in the fairings, it'll be in the fuel tank, it'll be in the seat. The lines just flow effortlessly through the whole bike. And in here, because you've got so many different elements, different shape languages all fighting with each other, this is what upsets your eye and your brain, and it's why you're thrown by it. It's not pleasant to look at. And just if that wasn't enough to deal with, you see the other side of the bike, which is just an absolute mess. So if you go onto the Harley Davidson website, you will notice something. You'll notice this has been photographed in certain ways, and I think it looks like there's been some Photoshop taking place to hide some of the tubes and wires and cables. But on a lot of bikes, so if you look at, say, a Triumph or something that's doing that retro kind of thing, they'll go to enormous lengths to hide wires, cables, tubes, hoses for cooling, things like that. Anything that confuses the eye line or throws out the aesthetic, a lot of bike manufacturers will go out their way to really hide those. And on this, it does not look like any of it's been hidden at all. If you're going to try and make a feature out of it as well, maybe like MV Agusta will make a feature out of these things, which is even more difficult. It takes time and effort to either hide them or make a feature out of them. And here it looks like an absolute mess. See, you can see this area if you zoom in on it. It's just unrecognizable. It's like a machine that no one cared about what the aesthetics of it were. It could be like a generator or an aircon unit or something like that. Something that normally would have no aesthetic appeal. It's an absolute shambles in there. And what causes that is not the people who designed the bike. What causes that is, I think they've been under great time pressure to get it done, and they've simply not had time to refine it in the way you would normally with a production vehicle. In particular, look at these big plastic covering elements on the radiator, and I think that's a rectifier down below. And when you actually see some close-up photos as well, there's wires and cables and hoses coming out of everywhere. And if you look at the part just in front of the fuel tank as well, there's random holes, there's bolts holding things together. Honestly, this doesn't look production. This looks like a prototype, which is what indicates to me that this was not given enough time to bake and for the design to be realised. Now, on a premium brand like this, I would not expect to see what essentially looks like a cheap box steel swing arm. When you see the swing arms that are engineered nowadays with modern engineering, they're absolutely beautiful on all sorts of bikes, even budget bikes. They really go out their way to make the swing arm a beautiful feature. Now, I know this is going for a sort of retro look, but still, that swing arm looks like it's from 1986. So just for comparison, I brought up the model it replaced, the old Dyna 883. Don't know if I've got the right accurate image here, but there's loads of images of them, so I just wanted to bring this up as a point. This is the same negative side of the bike, so there's no exhaust on this side, and it's so much cleaner, so much prettier. There's so much more thought has went into this. You can see through it. The elements have been hidden. There's minimal wiring or technical stuff. You can see the cylinders cleanly. Now, I know this is a oil-cooled or air-cooled bike versus the water-cooled modern one, which I understand why they do for emissions. But when you see how well people like Indian or Triumph can hide those elements, then there's no reason it couldn't have looked like this, just slightly updated. However, that would have taken time. That would have taken a long time to get right, because it would all have to be built as prototypes. The shapes, the engineering would all have to be worked out, and that's what slows down the design process. I would imagine that designing a bike would take possibly years. I know cars take years and years, where parts are built, tested, engineering is looked at, things are fiddled with. There's more goes into this than I could even imagine. And I've worked on some quite technical projects, which completely screams to me that the Nightster is just rushed. Now, the rushing of the design and the engineering of it can be caused by any number of things. It could be that the budget from Harley's upper management just wasn't there, and they wanted a product on the shelves essentially for a certain date, and they weren't prepared to move that deadline. That often happens. I've worked on things that have been rushed to meet, say, Christmas. Not that you're going to buy a bike for Christmas, but you know what I mean. A particular summer and they want it out. So the whole process could have been hustled along, and that's what suggests to me the mess of the actual design of it. You can also have a situation like the Ford Edsel. So if you're not familiar with the Ford Edsel, Ford spent millions and millions of dollars carefully researching and checking with marketing and trying to make a car that would appeal to everyone. It was a catastrophic failure, one of the biggest failures in car production of all time. Meanwhile, a bunch of engineers had taken parts, just parts, and stuck them together and were secretly working on the Mustang, because they knew if they told anyone they worked on the Mustang, it would have been shut down by management and marketing. Anyone who's ever worked on a project will understand this. Often projects are controlled and run by people who are not creative, and all they care about is bean counting or getting something done on time. Sometimes that's fine, that's necessary, that's what you have to do. Other times, with a premium brand like this, you can't be doing that. Harley Davidson's cost significantly more than a lot of other brands. They are seen and they sell themselves as a very high-end premium marketable thing. They're like the motorcycle equivalent of a really high-end, like Audi or someone like that. Their own marketing pushes them as a premium brand, and the Nightster itself costs significantly more than other bikes that it's supposed to be competing with as well, which makes it particularly egregious, because you could understand a rush design, about if it was a new brand, because often a lot of new brands haven't had years to establish themselves and they don't have a design language yet and they don't really know what they're doing. So the first couple of bikes can often look a bit messy, and you'll see this with car brands as well. You'll see these new Chinese car brands coming out and the designs are a bit all over the place and they're not particularly attractive. But when you've got a company like Harley Davidson that's long since established, their design and their brand is so ingrained in world culture too, that they have absolutely no excuse for making something ugly. Their entire design language is so ingrained, other manufacturers copy it. It's a name that's so synonymous with a particular style that people will look at other bikes in that style and think they're Harley Davidsons. Normal people that aren't semi-autistic like people who actually ride bikes. So what went on with the Nightster, I don't know, but it's because it's not got clear design, it's not got clear direction, it's got various conflicting shapes, there's not an overall design language, it's messy, it looks rushed, the actual engineering has tubes and hoses and parts just going everywhere, which is not, that just smacks of rushed. It's got many what I would consider corner cutting bits on it, so if you're paying all that money for something premium, it should be show stopping. It should be something that you pull up on and people are like, wow, that's a Harley Davidson, that looks amazing. And seeing this bike in the flesh and in photos, and especially the marketing of Harley Davidson, you can tell the marketing department have been fighting with how ugly it is, because they've been using Photoshop, they've been using clever photography, they've been using blurring, lighting, everything to hide a lot of it, so that when you're browsing online, you're not actually, like when I first seen when I was physically shocked by it. It's like seeing the Elephant Man, which is a honest reaction. That's one of the best ways of testing if something's beautiful. You don't, if you take all the badges off it and you just see it for the first time and you look at it and you go, that is a beautiful thing, then you know it's beautiful. Sometimes really great design, the more you look at it, the more beautiful things and layers of design you see in it. But the Nightster is just a failure of design. If you've got one, then it's totally cool. It's still a motorbike, it's still cooler than anything else. I just think stuff is going on in Harley Davidson and that is the result of it. I think the poor design team were probably rushed, the engineers were rushed, maybe marketing had too much of an influence. This can often happen. I don't know what's going on, but there's loads of other manufacturers making some absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful motorcycles, and this is not one of them. And I know it's bad because the first time I seen it, I sort of went, oh! I had a visceral reaction, and it's never changed. Every time I see it, I still have the same reaction. I've never found a depth or a hidden beauty to it that maybe I didn't notice the first time. It just doesn't work, and it's failed as a design, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's quietly dropped at some point when people stop buying it. And the biggest shame here is Harley Davidson themselves have always been a brand that really focused on making beautiful things that you aspire to own, and they've made this, and they're trying to cover up for the fact that it is not pleasant to look at. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. It's been fun to do. I'll mix it up with what I consider to be beautiful bikes and not so beautiful bikes. There's a few in there that might surprise you. There's a few controversial ones I want to do as well. It's been fun, and thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.